Hey everybody, my name is Jake Rivera. I've been really enjoying this course this semester, the New Testament Survey through the Biblical Studies program here with NAVS. It's been really fun to be in this class with you and to learn together and to really just grow in our knowledge of the Lord. So for my final project, I wanted to put together a tool that I could use in my ministry context, and I've created a diagram that I think will help people consider how they can be a servant in their life more in every aspect of their lives. One of the biggest things that stood out to me from this course was the idea of the although X, not Y, but Z formula that Michael Gorman lays out in his book, The Apostle of the Crucified Lord. And so I was just thinking about, how do I help a student work through this? How would I help my friend or my family? And so I created a tool called the Disposition Diagram. Got to go with the alliterations if you're NAVS. And so I wanted to work through it with you today so that I can just share it with you, and hopefully it can be a helpful tool for you as well. So let's jump in. So the question that I would start with is, how would you define the purpose of our Christian life? Another way to think of it is, why did God save us? What was the point? And obviously, if you're working with this through somebody, they would kind of have their answers. But ideally, we would help them understand, hey, I think the point, part of the big reason that we were saved is to look more like Jesus, to give God glory as we look more like his son, Jesus. Romans 8:29 says, those who God foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his son, right? And then Philippians 2 verse 5 says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. And so we're encouraged in the scriptures to live and to look like Jesus. And so in order for us to really do that, to really get a glimpse of what it looks like to be like Jesus, we have to know how Jesus lived. And so today we're going to look at that. The problem, I think one of the challenging things, is that Jesus lived kind of a dual reality while he was on earth. And so we're going to take a look at that. So we're going to draw a Venn diagram, and you're going to get a real good picture of my drawing skills here. Venn diagram. And we're going to put Jesus in the middle of it, because that's who we are going to highlight in our illustration for now. So we've got, I'm sorry, that's hard to see, Jesus. Okay, so we're going to open up our Bibles to Philippians chapter 2, and we're going to read verse 6. And we're going to stop when we get where we need to go. So he says, who, Jesus, though he was in the form of God. Okay, stop there. So when Paul says Jesus was in the form of God, what does that mean? Any ideas? So you'd ask your friend what that means. Well, the Greek for form just means essence, character, essential character, the unchanging nature. So when Paul says that Jesus came in the form of God, or he was in the form of God, it means he's still God. He's still in essence God. And so on the left-hand side of the Venn diagram up at the top, you're going to write God, because he's still God. Now, what are some attributes, what are some characteristics that you would ascribe to God? Another way to think about how should maybe we respond to God, or what can God do? What character attributes belong to him? So we're going to write some of those down. So some things that come to my mind: holy, worthy of praise, powerful, and I'll add one more: creator. And we're just going to write down those attributes of God under the God side here. Great. Okay, so we're going to continue reading in Philippians 2. So verse 6 again. Who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. So stop there. What does that word servant mean? Well, in the Greek, the word servant is doulos, which is slave. And so we're going to write slave on the top of the other side of the diagram here. And so you can see here, we've got God and slave, and Jesus in the center. I do apologize, that's pretty blurry. I'd have to get it right up there. Okay, so same question. What are some character attributes of a slave that you would assign to a slave? How would you treat a slave? What would you think when you think of slave? And try to keep an ancient Roman mindset in here. I know kind of doing this in modern day America is a little different, but when Paul says that Jesus took the form of a slave, he had a very Roman, ancient worldview mentality of a slave, of a bondservant. So what comes to mind? Well, I would say humble, obedient, submissive, right? Maybe not concerned with his own schedule or agenda, but with the agenda of its master. not self-interested. So we write down these attributes under slave. So we've got God's attributes, Jesus here, and slave's attributes on the side. These two sides seem really completely contradictory, don't they? Would you think that God, just in your mindset, even if you were thinking not as a Christian, would you think that God would willingly take on the attributes of a slave, right? It seems kind of backwards. It seems kind of foreign. And in fact, a lot of religions, this is a major problem with Christianity, is that God would never lower himself to be a slave, let alone a human, or reverse that, a human, let alone a slave. But this is how it is in God's upside down kingdom. As we said, this idea of Michael Gorman in his book calls this the although X, not Y, but Z principle. So we're going to write this down next to the diagram, here next to the side, so we can kind of get our heads around what's going on here. So we're going to reread Philippians 2, and we're going to read Philippians 2 verses 6 through 8, and we're going to kind of highlight what Jesus did as he lived in a slave, and kind of find this formula. So he says this: who being in the form of God did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So we have here, although he was God, so we circle God, although X, he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. I'm going to write this up here. So, although God, he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but Z took the form of a slave. This is the essence of the cruciform life. Cruciform just means to look like a cross. And so this is how Jesus did. This is how we become more like Jesus, to live more like he did. We live this way. So the reality is here, both of these things are very true of Jesus. Jesus did not stop being God when he became a slave. He just took the form of the slave to bring us more closer to God. He chose to live life as a servant. So one side of the diagram is unchanging, essential essence of who he is, essential truth, and the other side is a willful choice that he made to further the kingdom of his Father. So the question is, what does this have to do with us, right? What does this mean for me in my life? Well, again, we looked at Romans 8:29 earlier. Paul says, those whom God foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. And then Philippians 2:5, just looking a verse back, Paul says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, being in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. And he goes on to describe. So the question is, what do those verses say about looking more like Jesus and living like him? Right? It's to look more like God, to be humble, to become a servant. So it's our turn to draw a new diagram, except we're going to put ourselves as the center. So again, we're going to draw a very lovely diagram here, and I'm going to go ahead and use myself as an example. Jake. So I've got my diagram, and then there's me in the center here. So I want you to pick one aspect that you would kind of consider primary or central to your character. So for me, I'm going to say husband. I'm a husband. That's not all of who I am, but that's just a big piece of who I am and how I live. So I want you to now write or think about what are some attributes of that thing that you've chosen for me, husband, that are common or typical. How would you treat a husband? What would the world expect of a husband? And so I would say maybe authority, maybe a disciplinarian or discipline, maybe money maker, right? The world might say kind of decision maker in the house. Boss, some people would say. Husband's the boss. I don't necessarily think that, but so again, we've written on the right hand side here under husband, attributes. Now on the other side, we're going to write the associates. We're going to write servant. Now I'm going to use the word servant here instead of slave, because I think a servant, we can get caught up in some of the negative connotations, but I think the idea of a cruciform life is living like a servant. So on the other side here, so we've got husband and servant. So on the other side of the diagram will always be servant. So again, what are some attributes of a servant that are expected of them? How would we expect them to live? So kind of similar things that we wrote down for Jesus as servant: humble, submissive, willing to yield, maybe concerned with others, and etc. Okay, so we've got Jake, that's me. You're going to pick an attribute describing something that's important in your life or a big part of your character, and then servant and some attributes of character of the servant on the side. And again, the reality is, if we're followers of Jesus, we're going to live this although X, not Y, but Z lifestyle. So while these things are true of me, I'm still a husband. God is inviting me to live not with that authority, but as a servant. And so I can say here, Jake, although a husband, he did not demand authority to be the disciplinarian, to be the moneymaker in the family, to be the boss of his family, but became a humble, submissive, willing to yield servant that's more concerned with other people than himself. And so that's the question. How do we do that? So the key is this: the followers of Jesus, both sides of this diagram are true of you. See, Jesus didn't stop being God when he came to be a servant. And you don't stop being a husband or a student or a friend or a son or a daughter when you take on the attributes of a servant. This characteristic is still true of you. But what did Jesus do with that authority that he had? He put it off. He didn't exercise it. He didn't demand his way. He didn't demand his rights. And so to live like Jesus, we do that. We put off some of the authority that we could have, or the things that we think should accompany the title that we have, and we take on the form of a servant. So the application question for you today is to pick one servant attribute that you can apply and begin incorporating into your life, and begin seeking the Lord on that. How are you going to take on the cruciform life today? I encourage you to pray. So for me, I want to be more concerned with others than with myself. And so for me, that means being less interested or less involved with my own schedule, my own desires, and seek to serve those around me. So that's a really brief outline of that diagram that I created. Again, this was a really good course. I enjoyed the time, and thank you for watching me stumble through a tool I just created. All right, God bless you, friends.